Welcome to the blog, people. Entering late into a $100 freeze out, and not much more to say, so let's get to it.
The first hand we look at 3-2 offsuit in the small blind. We end up getting the under the gun, middle position, and cutoff to all call. So at this point, it's just worth a call. There's not worth throwing any additional money in there. So I decide to call, and the big blind decides to check. So now we're heading 4 ways to the flop. When the flop comes out, queen, 5, deuce, rainbow, there isn't really much option to do. I decide to check, and when the turn brings the jack of spades, I only decide to bet out 1 big blind just to give some protection to my hand. And when the big blind folds, the middle position actually ends up deciding to raise to 2,600. So after that happens, the cutoff ends up thinking about a wire but ends up folding. And at this point, this is clearly a fold for me, but honestly, I just like to sit here and pretend like I have a tough decision to make. So after a little bit of Hollywooding, I just decide to fold. This next hand was a fun one though. We looked down at king jack of spades on the button. So we get a few people to end up just deciding to call the blinds. And when it gets to me, I decide to bump it up to 1,600. And I think that's honestly a pretty decent sizing bet. I could have gone for a little more, but it's a lot easier for more people to just throw in a 1,000 chip. So when the small blind folds, the big blind folds, we get the hijack and cutoff to call. The flop comes out magnificent. We see it as jack, jack, 2, rainbow. So I flop trips, and what it's even better, the hijack ends up leading out for 2,000. And when the cutoff decides to fold, I decide just to call, just kind of slow play it and hope that he just builds the pot for me. So us two, we're going heads up to the turn, which is the 8 of clubs. So it doesn't change much, and he bets out for 2K, and I decide to call yet again. I was kind of hoping he would go for more value, but when the river brings the king of hearts and he checks, I bet massive for 20,000. So I'm trying to make it look like I'm trying to buy this, when in actuality I have the second best hand. And he's thinking about it for a little bit. The longer he takes, if I did 15, he probably would have called, but he ended up folding. Right into the next one, we see that I have jack, 7 of hearts in the hijack. With the low jack deciding to bump it up to 1,600, I decide to go for a call as well. This is a little more loose, but I think this is more comfortable to try and keep position. So I decide to go for a call, and the button and small blind decide to fold as well. So now that we're going 4 ways to the flop with the big blind, under the gun, low jack, and myself, the flop brings jack, jack, 8, rainbow. So flopping trip jacks yet again. I'm in a wonderful spot, and the under the gun actually decides to bet out for 3,000. And when the cutoff calls, I decide to call as well, and just kind of let them do the betting for me. I'm not really worried about it at all. And the big blind decides to fold. So now 3 ways heading to the turn, we see the 2 of spades. It doesn't really change much, although it does bring a backdoor flush draw out there. So when the under the gun bets 7K, I decide to go for a call. So with those 2 people out of the way, we are now going heads up to the river, which ends up bringing the 5 of spades. So now the spades do get there. A little bit concerning, but we end up checking it down, and he has 10s, so I get to scoop a nice pot. So as you can see, I'm running out of space for my chips, currently sitting at 85,000 in the 3rd level, and I look down at queen, 8 of hearts in the middle position. So it ends up folding to me. I decide to just kind of slow it down and just go for a call, and like the last hand, it's not really worth raising. But then the hijack ends up deciding to bump it up to 2,400. So a pretty decent sized bet. It ends up deciding to fold around to me, and in the moment I decide just to go for a call, and not really sure why, but oh well. Now that we're going to see the flop with a somewhat marginal hand, we see that it's king, king, queen, rainbow. So I end up getting a pair, and when I check to the hijack, he ends up throwing out 2,000. So at this point, it's pretty easy just to call. You know, I do have two top pair, so kicker isn't all that great. But the turn ends up bringing the jack of diamonds. So when I check and he bets out again, you know, I don't think I have any merit in calling. He's probably just got me dominated. Hopefully we can get back from the last one. I looked down at pocket eights under the gun, and with a pocket pair at early position, I decided to raise it up to 2,400. This is a little big for pocket eights, but I'm trying to show that I have a pretty strong hand. After a little bit of thinking, it ends up getting around to the dealer, who ends up calling. The small blind decides to call, and then the big blind actually decides to go all in, and it's for a large portion of my stack. He's got about like 45,000. I mean, he's basically all in. But at this point, with two people playing behind me, I don't really think that it's worth trying to call here and hope to get lucky. So at this point, you know, I'm losing a little bit of my chips, but it's better than losing them all on a coin flip. So in order to give the image like my hand is strong enough to call, I end up starting to try and count out my chips, and I'm just thinking, yeah, this is not worth it, and I just decide to toss him. If you hate reckless poker, I would recommend just skipping over this, but if not, we look down at ace 8 offsuit in the low jack position. So I end up deciding to call, and the hijack decides to bump things up to 2,000. So pretty standard raise. I was kind of on the fence about if I wanted to call or not, but when I saw one fold, I thought, okay, that helps me out a little bit. Again, reckless poker, but at least I own up to it. Anyways, we are heading 3 ways to the flop, which comes 8, 7, 3 rainbow. So I do have top pair and top kicker. I'm feeling pretty good about it. And when it checks to me, I decide to lead out for 2,500. When I do that, the hijack quickly re-raises to 10,000. The gentleman next to me, he is a little older, so he did have to get up and look at the cards so that he was reading them correctly. But after that, he does end up thinking and deciding to call. And with a raise and then a pretty quick call, you would think I would fold, right? Well, see, that's where you're wrong. You know, in this spot, I'm saying, you know what? I have top pair. Surely that's good here, when we all know it's not. So I decide to call somehow. And it doesn't help at all when the turn brings the king of diamonds. So that's even better. Surely one of these guys has kings, ace king, king queen, something like that. But now the under the gun player actually decides to lead out for 10,000. So I decide to call again for some reason. I don't know. And the cutoff decides to call as well. And the river brings the 9 of hearts. So at this point, I just check. We all check it down. And I am so far behind, it's not even funny. So, yeah. All right, never mind that last hand. I look down at pocket queens, and I am determined to get some of my chips back. With blinds at 800, I decide to go for a pretty hefty raise of 5,000. And we only end up getting one caller. It is the cutoff. And I have a lot of history of playing with this guy. He's pretty good. He's closer to my age, which is different if you've ever played at spades before. But he is the only caller. So we end up going heads up to the flop. The flop ends up bringing ace 8 4 with 2 clubs. So with the queen of clubs in my hand, and an ace on the board, this absolutely smashes my range compared to his. So I end up deciding to bet out for 9,000, and he thinks for a little bit, but he does end up deciding to call. So I didn't scare him away, and now we are going to the turn. When the turn brings the 7 of spades, it doesn't really change much. So I decide to check, intending for a check raise, but he actually does decide to check back as well. So I definitely lost a little bit of value there, but not too worried about it. When the river brings the Jack of Diamonds, this is another perfect card for me to fire away on. Now it makes it more likely that I could have Ace King, Ace Jack, or Jacks, or anything of that matter. So I'm thinking here, I can't check because I can't lose any value. But I think if I go all in, I think it would seem too fishy and seem like I'm just trying to bluff it away. So I decide to lead out for 33,000, which is a huge overbet, but he actually ends up deciding to tank for a really long time. And I'm sitting here thinking, usually what they say is the longer they think about it, the better off you are. But after this hand, I actually end up finding out that he folded an ace. So a little spoiler alert, but he does decide to fold. He actually showed the ace face up. So that was a huge bluff. I ended up telling him afterwards, but yeah, he's a really cool guy. I got a lot of respect for him, but yeah, good hand for me. Okay, so that last pocket pair did me some justice, got some chips back. So now let's keep it going. I looked down at pocket tens in the low jack, and I decided to bump things up to 2,500. I know my bet sizes have been all over the place whenever it comes to my pairs that I've had and everything, but I'm just trying to mess around and see what kind of pairs gets the most calls, gets the most folds, all that kind of stuff, especially in my certain positions. So when I call, we also get the middle position and the big blind to call. So we're heading 3 ways to the flop. And as if the night couldn't get any better, I flop middle set with Jack 10 9 rainbow. So when it checks to me, I decide to lead out yet again for 4,500. He ends up sitting and taking kind of quite some time on whether or not he wants to call or fold. But during this time, I'm thinking he maybe has some kind of King Jack, Queen Jack, Jack 10 or something like that. But he ends up deciding to fold. And we do get the big blind to call. So heads up in position, heading to the turn, which brings the 7 of diamonds. It doesn't really change much except for that a random 8 gets there. She decides to check, and I decide to check back as well, kind of cover my hand. And the river brings the perfect 9 of spades. So I have the third best hand here. And when she decides to bet out for 8,000, then I take the liberty of thinking, no, not enough. So I decide to bet huge. I think I ended up deciding to bet around 35,000, something like that. And, if she has a 9 here or even an 8 or something, size ends up being way too much because at that point she ends up deciding to fold. So she probably did have like an ace 8 or something like that. So, oh well. After that last hand, we end up getting to the final table. And first hand, we look at King 10 offsuit on the button. We are currently 7-handed. So when it folds around to me, I decide to bump things up to 9,000. And when the small blind folds, the big blind folds, the under the gun, which I've played a lot of poker with, he's pretty good, he does end up deciding to call. So heads up in position to the flop, we see that it is King 9 5 with 2 hearts. So when he checks, I bet out 13K and he folds pretty quick. So not much, but it's honest work. With how long this night's been going on, I'm getting tired. I want to go home, and I look down at Jack 2 offsuit on the big blind. So the under the gun player ends up deciding to fold, and everyone else decides to call. So at this point now we're 5 ways on the final table, and the flop comes Jack 10 for rainbow. So checks to me, I decide to check as well. I think I probably could have gotten away with a bet at this point, but the cutoff decides to throw out a small bet for 5,000. So the button decides to fold, the small blind calls, and I'm already here, I might as well call as well. At this point, I only have 25k left, and the turn 10 of spades, I decide to go all in here, and why, you may ask? It's a phenomenal question. I can't remember why. I think maybe just because there was the extra spade, there's a board pair. I thought that I'd be good, but both of them decided to call really quick. So that was wonderful to see. But no matter. At least I get to go home. The river brings out the 6 of clubs, and I am completely dead. So I just count my losses and turn the camera off at this point.
Thank you all for watching another video. Very fun tournament, and it was fun getting that bluff through with those queens. So I ended up getting knocked out in 10th place, so I was the bubble to the final table, unfortunately. But oh well, you know what happens. I'm slowly getting closer and closer to get to the final table and stuff. Next week's video is going to be a great one. Please like and subscribe, and remember, if we can get to 1,000 subscribers before the end of the year, I'll take $1,000 to a cash game and run that up for y'all. So please share this with everyone, and I'll see y'all on the next one.